So our third and final speaker for the panel and for today is Ayman Reda. He has come a long way from Lebanon. He received his PhD in economics from Michigan State University in 2005 and is assistant professor of economics at the Lebanese American University. And his work is on Islamic economic thought and the economics of religion and nonprofits. So we have more of a kind of economist perspective, giving us a deeper look at Islamic tradition, and delighted to have you.
Thank you. My title is slightly modified. It now reads, "Is there an ideal Islamic market, Islamic scripture, and the vision for an economic utopia?" The recent economic and financial crisis has led to a resurgence, especially intellectually, in the field of economics and other related disciplines. Much of this resurgence actually serves to question conventional economic wisdom. Of course, there's also some resurgence that serves to solidify conventional economic wisdom. The resulting discourse is inundated with questions of an ideal society, an ideal economic system. Specifically, I think it's filled with questions of what is our vision for the perfect or the ideal economic society. And of course, each vision for an economic utopia argues for its own theoretical and practical advantage. My paper seeks to carefully investigate the notion of an ideal Islamic market as a vision for an economic utopia. And I believe that there is such a thing as an Islamic vision for an economic utopia. And I also believe it's very different from the dominant neoclassical view of an economic system, or the mainstream or conventional view of what an economic system should look like, although it's very much similar to Jewish and Christian views of what an economic system should look like. So the aim of this paper is first to argue that there is such a thing as an Islamic vision for an economic utopia, and also to explain the structure and substance of this vision. Let me start with a quote by Oscar Wilde, where he says that progress is the realization of utopias. And by progress here, I mean in a very general sense. I do believe that every solution we propose to an existing problem is the envisioned product of an improved state of affairs. Every time we argue an opinion, we have a vision within ourselves for what we believe a better society would look like. And even though people do have a sensitive view of the word utopia, but I do think it's a common theme in most of our thoughts and ideas and arguments, even though we may prefer not to give it the label of utopia. And so I also believe that any blueprint for an economic system is essentially a particular vision for an economic utopia. And so what we have are competing visions of economic utopias out there, each claiming its superiority in terms of ethics, in terms of efficiency, in terms of feasibility and practicability, and so on. I also believe that even the defenders of a status quo can be rightly considered utopians, because they can be arguing for more of the same progress. They're okay with what we have. And to them, the current status quo is simply the vision they would like to have and continue having. So utopias, therefore, I define, are calls for continuity or change, and they constitute a basic human mode of thought and should not be construed as the intellectual fancies of a disillusioned group. I believe that the idea of a utopia is not something that we can restrict to a minority. It's something we all think about explicitly or implicitly. Jeffrey Hodgson, a prominent economic historian of thought, argues that the designation historically was given to socialistic or communistic visions involving collectivist ideals and shared property, as in the ideas of Plato, More, and Marx. However, he believes, and he very well argues this point, that even the schemes of pro-market libertarians are equally idealistic and utopian. In economics, we teach students in micro and macro also that the market of perfect competition is the ideal. It's the reference by which we judge all other markets. Okay. So utopias share the goal of achieving a perfect society where perfection is the realization of that which is sought and not necessarily some religious progression towards a more ethical state. So my idea of a utopia is very general. It's not necessarily becoming more ethical. It's just that you have a vision, and the closer you get towards that vision, the closer you're getting towards that utopian system that you seek. In a Platonic or Marxist vision, communal property constitutes the economic structure of the ideal community towards a classless and just society. And of course, even though there's much in common between Plato and Marx, there's even more differences between them, but they did have some similarities in terms of their ideal state or utopian state. In a Hayekian free market vision, it's private property and markets that characterize the economic basis of society. So I'm giving well-known examples of utopian models out there. And public interest is best served by unintended spontaneous order, which is the interaction of self-seeking individuals. Hodgson himself argues for his own version of a utopia, which he calls an evotopia, a concept that appeals to an evolutionary view of economic progress and that merges some aspects of private and public property, some aspect of markets and government intervention, and so on and so forth. An underlying theme of all of these visions, one theme that is sometimes explicitly stated, but most of the time it's implicitly assumed, is the precondition of a change in human nature that precedes the realization of the utopia. So there's always this presumption that the utopia can only be achieved if there is a change in human nature that sets the ground for that utopia to be realized eventually. In other words, a particular vision for an ideal socioeconomic system, I believe, presupposes a corresponding view or vision of an ideal human. Okay, so what would an ideal Islamic market look like? Or what would an Islamic vision for an economic utopia look like? And we're going to discover this by verses from the Quran and traditions from the Prophet, otherwise known as hadith. So we start with exchange. What does the Quran say about trade or exchange? Believers, consume not the wealth you trade among yourselves dishonestly unless it be a commercial deal resulting from mutual agreement. So the first criterion for exchange in economics is mutual consent. The Prophet also has several traditions that reinforce this view. Indeed, exchange is based on mutual agreement, and you cannot acquire someone else's property until there is mutual consent. The Prophet goes further, and now he's even more specific. God blesses one who is generous when he sells, buys, and solicits. So now there's an additional criterion. Beyond just mutual consent, there's generosity and there's mercy. God forgives the one who is merciful when he sells, buys, and solicits. In other words, it's a golden rule for exchange. And finally, a tradition that I really like, benevolence is one aspect of profit. A famous commentary on this verse argues that the previous, let me just go back, the first verse we have, consume not the wealth you trade among yourselves dishonestly, so there's an exception, that the acceptable way is a commercial deal resulting from mutual agreement. So Tabatabai interprets this verse to say that the verse mentions one type of dealing which can regulate the diverse affairs of the society, strengthens its backbone and keep it steadfast, and that is the trade with mutual consent, done in the correct way, which can easily fulfill all needs of society. So the interpretation takes the verse a step further. Mutual consent by itself is not enough for exchange to be acceptable from an Islamic point of view, but that exchange has to be done in the correct way and fulfill a social function as well. He goes on to say, a man is rightly guided by nature for fulfillment of his needs to the exchange of goods. This is a especially interesting commentary because it gives you some idea, it gives you a message very similar to that of Smith, of Adam Smith, when he talks about the invisible hand. Of course, this view of trade is limited to trade as opposed to interest, gambling, and deceptive trade or fraud, which are considered as wrongful. So what is the basis for exchange that we can infer from these verses and traditions? One, there is a personal benefit, which is the mutual consent part. And this could be because of having personal independence, not relying on others, so trade is good in that part. Livelihood, to earn your own livelihood yourself. Specialization, that different people can exchange different products and increase their welfare. Two, social benefit. And this is where this issue that has baffled Western scholars and philosophers for centuries, the link between private and social benefits, or the link between personal and social interests. How do we reconcile private and public benefits or interests? Duncan Foley, in a very interesting book called Adam's Fallacy, argues that the logical fallacy in Smith and others is that neither of them has been able to demonstrate rigorously and robustly how private selfishness turns into public altruism. And this is the basis, this is the single most important basis of modern economic philosophy and modern economic theory. And of course, it didn't start with Smith, but goes even before to Mandeville, Hume, and others as well. Third aspect of trade in Islam is commutative justice, which goes back all the way to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and so on, and that is justice in exchange, the issue of contracts, just price, and so on. I want to start with personal benefit is straightforward and self-explanatory. You have mutual consent, mutual benefit, trade will take place. But what about social benefit? How do we reconcile private and social interests from an Islamic point of view? This reconciliation or unification role is the role of religion. Bakr al-Sadr, who is probably the first Islamic economist of the 20th century and one of the pioneers of the field of Islamic economics, argues that the goal that Islam set out, after arguing against Smith and others on the link that they make between private and social interests, which to Smith and others, it was more an unintended consequence of spontaneous order, that things just happen to move from private to social. So he's arguing against this. And he says there has to be some logical link between the two. You can't just leave it up to spontaneous order. So he argues that this link is divine satisfaction, that you have an ultimate goal, overarching goal, which links the two. And the goal that Islam set up for human beings in their lives is divine satisfaction. And the moral criterion by means of which all actions must be weighed is only a measure of this glorified goal that these actions can achieve. The righteous human being is one who achieves this goal, and the complete Islamic personality is the one which, in its various advances, moves by the guidance of this goal in light of this criterion. So the goal is divine satisfaction. The criterion is linking the private and the social, which is what divine satisfaction actually does. So the righteous consumer or producer, if we want to talk now in terms of business, while seeking an immediate personal benefit from market exchange, will intentionally seek to achieve a social benefit as well. How? By virtue of the conscious and constant effort to achieve divine satisfaction. And this is the idea I seek to illustrate further in my paper. So in a sense, divine satisfaction signifies the end while informing the means of economic action. And I think the best illustration is the tradition by the Prophet, which says benevolence is one aspect of profit. Al-Ghazali, one of the most prominent Islamic philosophers and theologians of medieval times, talks about a nice story about a pious merchant who had instructed his agent back then to travel with his goods to Basra in modern-day Iraq to be sold in its markets. Upon arriving, the agent was advised by others to hoard the goods for a week, to corner the market, basically, with the intent of selling them at a higher price. So the agent was given good modern advice, by modern standards, of course, and he thought he was doing the owner a favor, and he actually followed the advice. So he sent a message telling him, I actually earned you more profit than you expected, and the merchant responded this way: you have acted contrary to my wish. It was not my wish to make a loss in religion and gain profit in commodities. And in other words, the merchant's definition or view of profit is very different from the way many of us view profits today. To him, there is such a thing which is far more important, and that's profit in religion itself, using profit metaphorically. Ghazali argues that to take less profit is benevolent. Of course, we're talking pecuniary profits. We're not talking religious profits in this case, which could be defined as salvation, for example. The fourth caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib, used to wander the markets. So these are different examples, and saying, "O merchants, take your dues and return the dues of others. Don't refuse little profit, or else you will be deprived of greater profit in the afterlife." Other examples by Al-Ghazali include how you can be benevolent, to sometimes accept a lower price for a commodity, to grant time when soliciting payments. This is the be merciful. Demand payments and debt in a kind manner, and for borrowers to pay debts to lenders kindly and earlier than expected if you can, to forgive needy buyers of their payment. The ultimate objective then, stated as divine satisfaction, becomes the driving force to achieve personal and social objectives, and it nullifies the chances for any perceived conflict between the two. This is the reconciliation role of religion that Sadr was talking about. By proclaiming that benevolence is one aspect of profit, the hadith has in effect integrated private and social interests into a unified objective. There is a logical link between the two. And the objective of a producer is no longer to maximize pecuniary profits, but to achieve a proper balance between private profit-seeking and social benevolence. And this is made possible by the self-realization that such a balance will attain profits in the afterlife. Third aspect, commutative justice. And now we move on to the field of contracts. Different verses that talk about trust and contracts and obligations to respect one's obligations. Believers, fulfill your legal obligations. If you trade with one another, summon witnesses, and let no scribe or witness come to any harm. Give full share in the measure and balance, acting justly. Be fair in measures when you measure out, and weigh with a balance that is true. That would be better and more rewarding. Rewarding in this life and the afterlife. These are traditions by the Prophet that reinforce the message of the previous verses. He is not one of us who betrays trust. The honest and trustworthy trader will be with the prophets, the righteous, and the martyrs on Judgment Day. Trade is now open to lying and false swearing, blended with honesty instead. Oath-taking was strictly forbidden by Islamic scripture. Fear Allah and avoid oath-taking, for it perishes merchandise and eradicates blessing. And I think oath-taking here is prohibited. Actually, economists would understand this as serving an information, a symmetry of information problem, in the sense that if you get into the habit of taking oaths, you beat the purpose of an oath, basically. So keep it out of markets, because at the end of the day, you cannot distinguish between honest and lying merchants. Also with contracts, the Prophet was always emphasizing transparency. People who were selling food at that time, that the quality of the food that you're displaying should be the same as that which is underneath. You cannot, other examples, you can't mix milk and yogurt with water because it's a form of cheating. You sell your product only after they have sufficiently ripened so the quality can be verified by consumers. And bribery, of course, was also prohibited. Now we come to just prices, another aspect of commutative justice. Prophet was reported to have been asked repeatedly to set market prices, and this was his response. Allah grants plenty or shortage. He is the sustainer and real price maker. I wish to go to him having done no injustice to anyone in blood or property. Something Adam Smith, I think, would have liked, in the sense that one popular interpretation of the invisible hand is providence. And it's an interpretation that I happen to subscribe to. This, in a sense, is similar. The fact that, but what's interesting about this is that it highlights that injustice may not result from unfair market practices only, but detrimental government action as well. In other words, as much as Islam is against market practices such as monopoly, hoarding, and so on, that may cause injustice, will cause injustice, but it's also against any government intervention that may lead to injustice. So it's interesting that it actually goes both ways and should not be interpreted just looking at one side of the argument. So a just price, therefore, from an Islamic perspective, is neither a predetermined price to be set by the government just randomly, nor is it the manifestation of arbitrary concentrations of market power, which is the way it is today for the most part, but should reflect the outcome of market interactions between participants who are primarily driven by a religious commitment to achieve a meaningful harmony between personal satisfaction and social benevolence. This is the reconciliation role of religion. And if you go back to Thomas Aquinas, and when he discussed the just price, many modern interpreters actually lean towards something like this. When Aquinas and others did talk about the just price, they were not talking about government setting prices. He was talking about an estimation, a market estimation of prices in a market that was, for the most part, competitive, market where participants were, for the most part, benevolent, and not any market price. Okay. Second aspect of an ideal Islamic market is, apart from structure of exchange, which we have looked at, but the character of a merchant as well, individuals. And many of those who have given talks today have emphasized that Scripture really talks to individuals. It doesn't talk about systems. It doesn't talk about blueprints of governments. It talks to individuals. And the Quran does the same. So in one verse it says, by men, traders, whom neither commerce nor trade distracts from the remembrance of God, from constant prayer and from giving alms. They fear a day when hearts and eyes will turn and turn again, when God shall reward them for their best deeds and multiply his favors upon them. And God bestows his bounty uncountable upon whomsoever he wills. Believers, when the call is made for prayer on Congregation Day, which is Fridays, hasten to the remembrance of God and leave your commerce aside. This is best for you if only you knew. When prayer is ended, then you can disperse in the land and seek the bounty of God and still mention God. Often, perhaps, you will prosper. What is interesting about these two verses, I believe, is that they describe a unified and complementary relationship between trade and religious obligations. None seeks to replace the other. Each has its own dignified place in Islamic scripture, but it's complementary in the sense that when you're engaging in religious services, it has its own spillover positive effects on your commerce. And when you're engaging in commerce, you should always keep in mind that you have a religious obligation which supersedes your own personal interests or profit-seeking or utility maximizing, as we say in economics. And the Prophet summarizes this very well in one of his sayings where he says, "He is not from us who gives up his worldly life in favor of his hereafter, nor is he who gives up his hereafter in favor of his worldly life." So there has to be this perfect balance between the two. We should not leave the markets and spend lifetime up in a tree praying all the time, and neither should we become so immersed in markets that we forget our religious obligations. And Al-Ghazali also reiterates this point when he says nobody should forget his religion in the next world, and that God's remembrance in markets is better. But how do you achieve this? This doesn't just happen. You have to educate merchants. So this complementary relationship between trade and religious obligations is only realized if there is conscious effort on the part of market participants to understand the nature of this relationship and to apply its propositions. This second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, said once, "Trade in our markets is only allowed for those who educate themselves in religious knowledge." Not get an MBA only, but you have to educate yourselves in religious knowledge. And the fourth caliph, Ali, is also reported to have asked a prospective merchant on whether he has educated himself in religious knowledge. And the merchant's response was, "That will come later. I'm busy buying and selling." And then he says, "Knowledge and then trade." So knowledge comes first and then trade. Because those who buy and sell and do not question what is halal or haram will repeatedly bump into usury. And the word usury here is very general than just interest taking, because as in Christian medieval times, also in Islamic medieval times, the word usury usually signified any act of trade or commerce where there's injustice involved. It's not only on loans and so on, interest on loans. In another instance, Ali also says traders, he says this 3 times to emphasize is knowledge, then trade. Usury in this community is more concealed than the creeping of ants. In other words, you can so easily commit injustice in a market, and the way you can prevent yourself from doing this is to understand the intricacies of market transactions and what religion has to say about these transactions. Finally, I like to conclude with a quote from G.K. Chesterton. "Islamic, Jewish, or Christian ideal, I believe, has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." And finally, I think the vision is always a fact. It is the reality that is often a fraud. That's G.K. Chesterton as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey Herfin, and I teach in the history department here at the University of Maryland. I was struck when you referred to something called Islamic economics.
Yes.
I would find it peculiar to refer to Jewish economics or Christian economics, because if I use those phrases, I think I would be talking about a pre-modern phenomenon. One either talks about economics or something else. And as a historian, I would say that the reason that the West became wealthy was because it abandoned notions of Christian economics or Jewish economics or Islamic economics. It broke the hold of religion over economic activity. And other parts of the world that didn't do that didn't become as wealthy. So the phrase Islamic economics makes many of us nervous. And you're extremely thoughtful. It's been an extremely thoughtful talk. And I imagine you've thought about this a great deal. So I'd like to know what you think about that problem.
Great, thank you. Your opinion, if you allow me to say this, is very much similar to Max Weber's thesis. And when he studied the Protestant Reformation in Europe, in others of his studies and books, he contrasted this with China, India, and to a lesser extent, although he had the intention of actually writing a whole book on the Islamic world, but he did talk a little bit about the Islamic world. And his argument was that, similar to your argument, that the reason the Islamic world fell back from an economic point of view, even though for centuries it was way ahead of Europe, economically speaking, but the reason it fell back and Europe overtake the Islamic world was because the Islamic world at some point failed to reform itself, basically. And his argument was twofold. On one side, he was arguing that there's something inherent in the religion itself that restrained growth and development. And another aspect was the institutions themselves did not develop over time, but were static, even though both are limited, interrelated to some extent. I don't subscribe to that view. In fact, I have a paper that argues quite the opposite. And I'm not going to go into the literature out there that also questions Weber, something that David alluded to. But I don't think that religion, I think if we do come up with this conclusion from this conference, that would be really depressing, though, if we believed or concluded that religion is the reason for underdevelopment. But I don't subscribe to that. And I believe that my talk, I think, shows this, that there's very much in Islamic scripture that's very positive of trade and commerce. And now, of course, there are differences. I mean, in the Islamic world, the scripture would be against interest, for example. If you were to make the argument that prohibiting interest would prevent you from ever achieving growth like Europe achieved from the 15th or 16th centuries onwards, then of course history will be more favorable towards supporting your argument than supporting my argument. But theoretically, I would disagree with the view that even Christian economic thought or Jewish economic thought has a negative impact on economic growth. And we're talking theoretically. I'm not talking about economics and business as practiced by Muslims, Christians, and Jews. I'm talking about Islamic economic thought in theory, Christian economic thought in theory, and Jewish economic thought in theory. That's the first part. The second part is the idea of an Islamic economics. Actually, Islamic economics is a very modern phenomenon. It's what I would call thinking related to economic issues in medieval times, Islamic medieval time. I would call that economic thought and not economics. If we want to give economics more of a scientific connotation, then that's very modern. And one of the pioneers was Bakr al-Sadr that I cited in my paper. But Islamic economic thought itself, I would argue, goes back to the beginning of the religion, just as I would argue that Christian economic thought goes back to the beginning of Christianity. It's economic thought I define in very generic terms, simply any type of thinking related to economic issues or economic matters. And even that I have a problem with, because I don't think there are really differences between, we cannot say this is economic or political or religious and so on. Back then, I think when they merged all together, they were doing better than us. Because the fact that we wanted to move, and this is this inferiority complex that the field of economics has, that it wants to achieve the status of a scientific discipline, has come at the expense of many of the things we're suffering from and we are complaining of today.
I'm actually not going to use the microphone because I don't want to infect the rest of the group. You know, but I have to sort of take what may seem like a counter position to what the gentleman back there just said, because I have been a long time, especially working in an interfaith organization, practitioner of Islamic finance envy. And one of my hopes that this inaugural conference might initiate is sort of the idea of Abrahamic finance, because I'm one of the Catholic participants in the Islamic law project that Harvard Business School and Law School works on. And one of the things that I so envy is that there's been, because so much of Islam, this is my opinion, because so much of Islamic finance does come up against some modern capital creation mechanisms like interest-bearing bonds. The amount of work that's gone into creating structures that redefine justice, I think, is really, really interesting. And if we put our heads together as the continuum of Abrahamic faiths, I think we could make it even more interesting. And then the other piece is more and more evidence, and this is actually what I'd like you to comment on rather than just make another speech. More and more evidence seems to indicate that positive and negative externalities will need to be accounted for in models for risk moving forward from where we are right now. And when I hear about the principle of benevolence, I think about sort of social capital, the building of social capital, and how, you know, how it relates to the sort of social accountability standards board metrics that accountants are looking at it, all of those things. And I'm wondering if you could just comment on sort of the leading edge of either Abrahamic finance or making accounting for social capital and positive and negative externalities a bigger, more robust part of how we make economic judgments.
Okay. I think now I have many reservations about, not myself only, I think many Islamic theologians will have many reservations about how Islamic finance is done or is practiced today. And that could be more just a way of concealing an image that looks very much like conventional banking, but just giving it an Islamic appearance. So I would say that Islamic finance so far is not very encouraging. If I am comparing it to theory, if I'm comparing it to this Islamic vision or this ideal Islamic type of market. And this is simple. You can simply take practice and compare it to what these theologians and jurists have said, and you're going to see there's this discontinuity or this gap. And it's becoming more and more, people are becoming more and more aware of this problem. So moving from Islamic to much broader, that encompasses Jewish and Christians as well. And I'm saying this as someone who specializes in Islamic economic thought. I think we should first be really convinced about what Islamic finance is doing before we decide to export its strategies and policies and systems and so on to other religions. I'm more interested in what the theory says, what the scripture says. And if the practice falls short, then of course you can always revise the practice. And of course, maybe the Jewish and Christian economic thought, they have their own versions of what finance may look like, which may not be exactly the same, although I think they're the same in theory, but that's up to them. I'm not an expert in Jewish and Christian economic thought. that would be their judgment to make. The second question was about
if you will, monetizing benevolence, you know, and sort of accounting for
okay.
it
I teach positive and negative externalities in my classes, but I think I would be really doing harm to the idea of benevolence if I explain it in terms of that language. I'm very, very skeptical of economic terminology and its imperialistic nature when it starts using its logic to permeate other disciplines. So maybe you can convince economists that benevolence is good if you describe it as a positive externality. But that's as far as you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Duggan from the Law School at Catholic University. Thank you for your talk. I've learned so much today. I have a question about the saying of the second caliph. You talked about trade among us is allowed only by those who educate themselves in religious knowledge.
Yes.
And I'm curious about how that plays into the kind of thing we're doing today, because one of the questions, as Dr. Kaufman said earlier, is where have religious traditions been lately? Is this an individual obligation? Is it a community obligation? Is it one that's mediated by the religious authorities? And how does that fit into this whole idea of what our roles are as teachers, as people of faith, and as individuals?
Right. Actually, he has also another saying where he stresses that trade should also be allowed only to those who educate themselves in business skills as well. So, but I thought that goes without saying. So his argument then is that, okay, you want to enter a market. And if you believe that learning the skills of business, earning an undergrad or graduate degree in business is relevant to enter markets and be a market participant, then why not treat religion the same way? If we, of course, he is saying this in the context of a society that is religious, in the context of a market where participants do adhere to a particular religious creed. This does not apply to someone who doesn't believe in these religious scriptures. But the education, I would imagine that education in a religious society would be very much like education in a secular society. You do all in universities and so on, but instead of just teaching business and science and economics, you're also teaching theology and rituals and religious obligations and exegesis and jurisprudence and so on and so forth.
So there's an obligation on the part
Yes.
of the institution, not just on the part of the individual. That's really my question. Where is the
Not just on the part of, yes, definitely. Yes, definitely. But that, if the institution doesn't provide the education, doesn't excuse the individual from earning it herself or himself, then you still have the obligation.
So I haven't done this yet, exercise, quite provocative. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to do it now. I'll sneak one and ask you a question. So, you know, I found really intriguing the discussion of trade in a correct way by mutual agreement. So the mutual agreement part evokes Adam Smith and Hayek, the correct way.
Commutative justice.
Exactly. So I take that to mean that if a bunch of market participants wanted to, say, agree on on kind of market conventions that allowed caveat emptor or allowed what the traffic would bear, that's not acceptable, right? Because that might lead to, you know, like my merchant who had 100% profit. So that's not acceptable. So now I want you to put your economist hat on, and I was thinking, what are the implications for that for an economy, right? So in one sense, you could say that means that there's a lot of pressure. There's almost no opportunity for rent seeking. That profit margins will be squeezed. Our some of the implications that this will lead to a society with more equal distribution of wealth and income. Is another one a society that discourages entrepreneurial risk-taking? So that's my question.
Okay, interesting. Okay, remember, in this ideal vision, there is this objective which supersedes all other objectives, and that's divine satisfaction. So risk-taking, in a sense, would be irrelevant, because you're not after the material incentive anymore. You have supposedly an incentive that's even better, and that is to achieve blessing, to achieve salvation. And if someone comes to you and says, I want to borrow money, I'm in need of a loan, you don't worry about earning interest anymore. You worry about helping him out, because that's how benevolence looks like.
So what about helping society by creating jobs?
I don't, but why would you think that such a vision goes against creating jobs? Again, from an economic point of view, it doesn't necessarily. In other words, we have this assumption that there has to be a material incentive for you to undertake investment, which at the end of the day will create jobs. But first of all, this material incentive is not destroyed completely by this vision. No, it's there, but it's secondary. You have an even higher obligation to provide jobs for, if you can, for others, and it's not. And of course, it's a vision for an egalitarian society as well. I mean, that cannot be concealed. This is how Islamic economic thought is very similar to Christian economic thought, or maybe Jewish economic thought. There's this egalitarian dimension to it. And it's not the view of, well, we have a group of entrepreneurs and wealthy individuals who are going to be the beacon of hope for society as a whole. No, every single person is part of this system, and each in his or her own way is contributing to this, to everyone else's livelihood, in a sense.
Well, I hate to take the punch bowl